Football is back is what everybody was tweeting over the weekend, even though football really never went anywhere. But I get the sentiment, right? Everybody is excited that the NFL and NFLPA have come to an agreement to start the camp and the season on time. Now, while there is some cause to celebrate, like many did over the weekend, there also are some things to kind of worry about, especially when you look at the agreement more in detail. You find things that are going to have a massive impact on everybody's season, but especially the Cleveland Browns season. So what are those things? Well, let's talk about it. Real quick before I jump into the topic of the video, please don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and ding that notification bell so you can be notified. NFL season is back. Everything's going to be coming very soon, so you're going to want a source of news when it happens, and click that subscribe button and ding that notification bell so you won't miss a video and you won't miss out on anything as far as the 2020 season is concerned. I'm uploading all the time, so hit the subscribe button and hit that notification bell. Now back to the video. Now the details have come out over the weekend for this agreement between the NFLPA and the NFL. And in that agreement were some interesting details that have not really been discussed as much as I think the implications deserve being discussed so far. And I think personally that three of these things are going to have a massive effect on how this season goes down, how it's going to look like, and what this especially means for the Cleveland Browns. And those three things are the CV-19 IR list, the 2-week acclimation period during training camp, and the player opt-out clause. Now what I'm going to do is break into each of these individually, and I'm going to start with So what is the 2-week acclimation period? So essentially, normally when training camp starts, the first, second, and third practices cannot be padded or touched. It's pretty much an OTA for the first 3 days of practice, but that fourth day of practice can be padded, and there's no limit on how many padded practices you can run. It varies wildly between teams. The Pittsburgh Steelers run a high amount of padded practice. Freddie Kitchens last year ran an abnormally high amount, but you can recall Rob Chudzinski and Mike Pettin ran relatively low padded amounts of practice. So that varies. Well, that's not going to vary anymore. The new rules are it's going to essentially be OTAs until August 17th when padded practices are allowed to start. So there's going to be this ramping up period during that time where they're testing every day, and then they're going to cut the roster down to 80, and then they will then be able to start padded practices. So that is a big difference. And that is a huge slice of camp essentially just being cut out in order to make up for OTAs. Now, again, camp, the amount of time camp's going to have is not different from last year. The season is planning on starting on time, which means this is going to get really cramped for a lot of teams, especially teams like the Browns with a new head coach. And then again, this is going on top of losing OTAs, losing mini camps, losing all of those things, and then you go into training camp and you lose about half of training camp. This is going to be significant for everybody in the NFL, and it's going to affect how the football looks. There's already going to be no preseason games, so expect some sloppy football to start out the season. That's all I'm going to say. Another key reason why there's probably going to be some sloppy football is because also padded practices are going to be limited. Now, they're going to be limited to 14 practices, which is kind of an arbitrary amount. It sounds really severe if you just say it when you're used to the context of there being like 20 to 25 padded practices in a regular training camp. But given that there's already a large chunk taken out of training camp, those 14 days aren't really that much because they're going to be squeezing those 14 padded practices if they can have them in 20 days. But you have to also remember there's 2 days off in an NFL training camp normally. And that means that 20-day period is really 14. So NFL teams have the option after August 16th to make every practice a padded practice for like 2.5 weeks straight, which honestly doesn't sound like something that a lot of teams are going to take advantage of. Again, only a few teams run a ton of padded practices, and Freddie Kitchens is the only one I can remember that ran nonstop padded practices, and that didn't work. And honestly, just don't do anything Freddie did. So I don't think there's going to be like 14 padded practices taken advantage of, because just that time period from the 16th to September 5th, when camp rosters are over and final rosters have to be in, it's just not enough days. And again, you can run 14 of those padded practices in that short time frame, but again, that is going to risk injury. And given everything that you're going to be battling during the season when it comes to just trying to keep people off the injured list for various reasons, it doesn't make sense to raise the risk of physical injury by having so many padded practices back to back in the NFL. So what does this all mean as far as the 2-week acclimation period? It means that the Browns essentially are going to have only 14 days of padded practice during the training camp period, and then 14 days of padded practices throughout the entire season in 2020. Because again, let's remember that in the CBA, the players can only have 14 padded practices during a NFL season. That has not changed. So 14 padded practices during training camp, 14 during the regular season, 28 total days of padded practices the Browns have to fix this offense, 14 of them before the season starts. That's going to be a very difficult job for Kevin Stefanski. It is going to be an immediate test, a push into the deep end for Kevin Stefanski. And oh, by the way, he probably just found out probably a day or two ago that these are the circumstances he's going to have to deal with. So he has to throw out the schedule that he's been making all summer and come up with a new schedule before the veterans show up in like 3 days. So not a great position for Kevin Stefanski to be in, to just be a new head coach, period. But not only a new head coach, a first-year head coach. So that is an issue. Also, the big elephant in the room is that Jarvis and Odell are still rehabbing from injury. They weren't going to be available for this portion of camp to begin with. Will they be available come mid-August? Maybe. That might be the case. But also, it's not guaranteed that they're both going to be back. And if you're the Browns, you're desperately going to need everybody to be able to practice for those 14 days that you get to try to put this offense together with padded practices. So for the Browns, this is not a great situation, especially for the offseason. So they don't get any of the practices for OTAs. I don't know how many of the practices during the acclimation period you're going to be able to just kind of install an offense, period. But again, they're squeezing the entire offseason into a regular training camp. This is going to be weird. To me personally, I wish they would have either extended camp and started camp earlier, or push back the season a couple of weeks to make up for some of the lost time, because I think this is going to have some consequences. I think you are going to have a rash of injuries pop up on a number of teams, and just kind of a chaotic situation that's going to lead to a lot of anxiety on whether this season can happen during the month of August. I don't think they put themselves in a great position here to have this in the best possible way, but we'll see. I could be completely wrong on that, but there's another factor that I want to talk about, and that is the CV-19 IR list. This is essentially, for all intents and purposes, going to be very similar to the concussion protocol, because testing is mandatory. They're going to test, once a day for the first 2 weeks of camp, and then once every 2 days, once they get the percentage of players who have this under 5%, they'll go down to testing every other day. So they're going to be testing regularly. And the reality of this situation is that if anybody tests positive, they are immediately placed on the CV-19 IR list, which means they're going to be out a minimum of 2 weeks, from all the information I've gathered about this virus, if you get it, it takes 2 weeks to get rid of at the minimum, and it could take anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks on top of that. So a minimum of 2 weeks that you're going to miss that player from when they had that positive test. So concussion protocols are generally a week or 2 weeks. You miss a player if they test into the concussion protocol, you know they're going to lose them for 1 game at least. It's going to be the same thing, but a little bit worse with the virus protection protocol. And also consider that you can get this virus more than once. Just because you get it doesn't mean you're immune to getting it for the rest of the season. You can get this, get rid of it, and then pick it up again just as easy. So that's going to be exactly like concussion protocol, except for one critical factor that makes it much, much, much more scary for fans and anybody who is on an NFL team or anybody who has their hopes tied into an NFL team. Because with concussions, there are specific rules in place to make sure that players of high value, usually quarterbacks, don't get concussions and can avoid concussion protocols. The rules are specifically in place to avoid quarterbacks getting physically injured and getting concussions. And there are other rules in place to just lower concussions in the context of football. In certain positions just aren't going to get as many concussions. Your running back might get a concussion more than your left tackle or your left defensive end. It just so happens that where players are less likely to get injured or concussions, it's also where you spend more money. But with the virus, it ain't like that. The NFL can't really control it within the context of football because this thing does not just exist only in the context of football. It exists in the wider world. So instead of having rules in place to protect quarterbacks from getting concussions and that kind of lowering the amount of quarterbacks that enter concussion protocol, you're going to be in a situation where all that's got to go wrong is that somebody in Baker Mayfield's immediate touch forgets to wash their hands, whether it be his wife, whether it be his friend, his brother, his family, anybody, his trainer, one of his teammates. Somebody touches him, he forgets to wash his hands, wipes his nose, boom, he's out for 2 weeks. And if that happens again, boom, another 2 weeks. Boom. Same thing for Myles Garrett. Same thing for Nick Chubb. Same thing for everybody on the roster. Odell, Jarvis, all of these important pieces are one dude's dirty hands away from just being wiped out for 2 weeks. And it's not even in the context of football. They could be at the grocery store and this goes down. What does this mean for you and I, especially you and I in Cleveland where these players are? Wear a mask, because if you reduce the amount of virus that's out there to contract, hey, your players might not have to go on this IR list and you might not have to miss 2 weeks of Nick Chubb or Myles Garrett. Could you imagine missing 2 weeks of Myles Garrett because he got this thing? You know what that defense looks like without him. We ain't trying to go back to that. It ain't going to take Myles Garrett to knock somebody across the head with the helmet to make it happen. It's going to take somebody just being dirty at the wrong time. So I'm going to wear a mask. I'd advise everybody to wear a mask. Do your part. Help the Browns. Wear the mask. Let's make sure none of our key players get this thing and miss 2 weeks. Also, there's some interesting restrictions that I'll put up on the screen right now. But essentially, if they're found breaking any of these restrictions and they test positive for the virus, those players don't get paid for the amount of games that they miss, and they are subject to further punishment by the team. So I think they're going to abide by these guidelines because those are pretty intense punishments for those players. Now, how they're going to go about figuring this out and investigating this, I don't know, but NFL teams usually keep a tight eye on their players regardless. So that whole thing could be a mess if teams don't take the extra steps to make sure that key players don't get this thing. And honestly, if I'm the Browns, quarantine Nick Chubb, quarantine Myles Garrett, just put him in a hotel room and keep him away from everybody else until the season starts, because Browns might be all right without Baker Mayfield. Browns might be all right without Odell or Jarvis, one of them. Browns ain't going to be all right without Myles, and the Browns ain't going to be all right without Nick Chubb. So, but let's jump into the next part, and that is Okay, so the player opt-out works like this. There are two different opt-outs available. There's an opt-out available to everybody. So if you don't have a immediate reason or a high-risk reason to opt out, you will get a $150,000 stipend and you won't get an accrued season. So what this means is that it's like a paid suspension. You don't get that year off of your contract, but you do get paid a little bit. So remember how Josh Gordon was on his rookie deal for like 10 years? It's essentially the same kind of concept. If you skip out on this season, if you had 3 years left on your deal when you entered 2020, you'll have 3 years left on your deal in 2021. It's not the same for players who are high risk or players who cohabitate, and that is important, cohabitate with somebody who is high risk. So if you live with somebody who is high risk, then you can opt out. You'll get a stipend of $350,000 a year, and you won't accrue a season. So if you were scheduled to be a free agent in 2021 and you were high risk and you opted out, you would still be a free agent in 2021. And what is capable of being called high risk, well, that is also here. And this is important because we have to remember as fans, while we may know about their health history when it comes to the context of football and how that affects their ability to play football, we really don't know anything about their long-standing medical issues that have never been seen as a problem when it comes to football. So this is things like asthma, this is things like sickle cell. I remember Ryan Clark on the Steelers had sickle cell. He couldn't play in Denver because of that. But I never knew that about Ryan Clark, even when he was at LSU, because it just generally wasn't brought up. These are the long-standing health issues we just don't know about players. Also, long-standing health issues that their loved ones might have. We don't know anything about their loved ones or anybody that they live with. So, again, we have no idea who's going to opt out there. I don't think a lot of people are going to take the first opt-out option because for star players, it's not attractive. You don't get a year off your season. You only get $150,000, which is a lot of money to me, but like to Odell, that's nothing. So I don't think a lot of people are going to take the voluntary opt-out. But if you are high risk and you have to opt out, that might happen more because, one, they have to protect themselves and their family. And two, it's just a more friendly package. So I don't know who's going to take that. I don't think star players are going to take it. But I do think there might be a decent amount of, rank and file players that are going to have to take it because it's going to make sense. And again, you got to do what's most important. That's completely understandable. And that's really the situation going on with football being back. It is great that they have some protocols in place. It does make me more confident that the season's going to play out without issue. I do worry about how this virus protocol is going to work with teams. Are teams going to take the initiative to make sure that their best players are in less of a situation to contract this thing on a day-to-day basis? But that's going to be something that could wreak havoc on the 2020 season. But everything else, I think, isn't really going to affect it as much. The camp thing and camp being squeezed in, at least that's universal for everybody. I do have a concern about that being for teams with first-year head coaches, but we'll see how this all works out. And the player opt-out, I don't think a lot of really known players are going to take that opt-out unless they're already in kind of adverse situations with their club. It's going to be an interesting situation, but again, football's back, and there's going to be more to talk about within the coming weeks. But let me know down in the comment section below what you think is going to be the most important factor or the biggest game changer in everything mentioned in this agreement between the NFL and NFLPA, and what do you think is going to affect the Browns the most? Let me know in the comment section down below. But again, guys, thank you guys for watching. Have a great day and have a good night.